Good morning. Thanks for coming today. The next talk, or the first talk of the day, rather, is going to be a discussion of the different societies on the internet from the perspective of political philosophy. Our speaker is Adam Obeng, and please give him a warm round of applause. Welcome.
Thanks, Chris. So as he said, the title of my talk is Tor is Peace, Software Freedom is Slavery, and Wikipedia is Truth. The first question you're going to be asking yourselves is, what on earth is this guy doing at CCC? How is this relevant to any of us? Well, I'm going to try to tell you. So, as the subtitle says, I'm here to talk about the political philosophy of the internet. What I'm going to attempt to do is analyze, using the tools and ideas of political philosophy, some aspects of some communities of the internet. And I thought that the best way to introduce it's a pretty large area of study, political philosophy, so the best way to introduce it would be to use a specific example. So the title of my talk is actually a little bit dishonest. It sounds like I'm trying to tackle the entirety of political philosophy and the entirety of the internet at the same time, but I've only got an hour to give this talk. So perhaps a more accurate title would be something like this: The Political Philosophy of Some of the Internet. And I've just chosen one basic philosophical concept, which is freedom. And I'm going to apply it to one type of community. So the FLOSS, or Free Libre Open Source Software Community. But the ideas and methods that I'm going to discuss can be used throughout political philosophy, and hopefully they'll apply to other communities as well. So I'm going to take a political question that's very important to these communities, and I'm going to try to work towards answering this question, drawing on the ideas that previous political philosophers have developed. The answer that I come to might be a little bit controversial, but probably not too much. So, philosophers have been studying the political realm, for thousands of years, and as I said, they've come up with all sorts of ideas and concepts which they use to analyze the behavior of communities and even to say how they think communities should behave. So, I'm going to take these tools, and because they're mostly used for the real world, I'm going to adapt them a little bit so that they can apply to virtual communities as well. Now, there's not that much, there's a bit of a difference, but it's not too bad, and most of the ideas carry over. But before I can do any of that, before I can do anything using political philosophy, I'm going to have to sort of say what political philosophy actually is. So, political philosophy has the words politics and philosophy in it. So I'm going to take those one at a time first and say what they mean. So first, politics. Politics is a study of power. Now, I've just replaced one word that I had to define by another word that I have to define, which is power. So what's power? Well, if there are any physicists or engineers in the room, I think you'll know what you think of power as being. I think I'm right in saying that in physics, power is the rate at which work is performed. In political philosophy, power is a similar thing, except power is the rate at which you can get other people to do work for you. So it's the ability to make other people do things, whether they want to or not. So politics is a study of this ability to make other people do things, and how you acquire this ability and how you can use this ability. Now, while power is the central idea of politics, you can apply power in many different contexts. So, of course, part of politics is what you normally think about, politicians and governments. Part of it is studying what politicians do with power, and part of it is studying governments comparatively and seeing how different countries regulate and distribute and manage the use of power. But politics isn't about government, and politics isn't just about politicians. Politics happens wherever there are transactions of power. So politics does happen in government, but politics also happens in families and in workplaces and in conferences. Politics, in fact, happens wherever there are people. wherever people disagree and wherever someone tries to make someone else do something for them. So I've been talking in the abstract so far. I'm going to give you an example of the exercise of political power. And one of the problems with philosophy in general is that we're often talking about very abstract concepts that are far removed from everyday experience. So it's important to give examples so that people can relate to the concepts that we're using. So it's also useful if the examples are drawn from the experience of the people you're talking to. So if I was talking to an audience of university students, I'd probably use examples of university politics. And if it was an audience of doctors, I'd probably use examples set in hospitals. But seeing as it's an audience of hackers, I'm going to use an XKCD comic. So I'm sure you've all seen this one. So what's going on here? So the first character requests a sandwich from the second character initially refuses, the first character rephrases the command, and then the second character obeys. So I think you understand what's going on here. So on Unix and Unix-like operating systems, there's a particular user, as you all know, the super user, who has all rights and privileges over the system. And the use of this sudo command allows you to temporarily become a user, normally to temporarily become the super user, and to carry out a command with all the rights and permissions. And what the comic is saying, it's making a joke of it, it's saying that in the real world it's not so simple. In the real world there's no magic word that you can just say and then everyone does what you want. Except maybe there is. But in fact, becoming the super user, as it might be, of a group of real people is actually quite difficult. Becoming the President of the United States is actually quite difficult. Nevertheless, it's interesting to note that this idea of power is built into the Internet at a fundamental level, at the software level. And it's not surprising that, because it's built in at the software level, the communities that are on top of it, built on top of the software level, also use transactions of power. So it's not a coincidence. So that's politics. So next, philosophy. So philosophy is thinking about stuff. It's a little bit vague. It used to be that any sort of thinking about stuff was called philosophy. So the sciences were called natural philosophy, and I'm sure they had other terms for other sorts of thinking. But nowadays, philosophy only really applies to certain sorts of thinking about stuff. Philosophy nowadays is only about thinking about stuff really hard. Now, why is this? Well, if you're at university in the United Kingdom, your first degree will probably be a Bachelor of Sciences or a Bachelor of Arts or something, and then your second degree will be a Master's. But it's only when you're really good at thinking about stuff, when you can think about stuff really hard, that you can become a doctor of philosophy. But still, that's a little bit vague. What does it mean to think about something really hard? Well, in fact, that's what characterizes philosophy. Philosophy is a way of thinking. The way you think is what makes you a philosopher. So to understand this philosophical way of thinking, perhaps it would be useful to compare it to other academic disciplines. It's another XKCD comic, I'm afraid. So what's going on here? So the comic is supposed to have arranged different academic fields of study by their so-called purity, by how removed they are from the empirical world, by how pure they are. So sociologists, all the way on this end of the graph, are the least pure of all subjects because sociology is just applied psychology. But psychology, in turn, is just applied biology, and so on, chemistry and physics, and the punchline being that mathematics is the purest of all subjects. Now, you'll notice that I'm talking about philosophy, and there's no philosophy on this diagram. That's better. So the philosopher who I've added on at the end, represented by Black Hat Guy, has noted that, in fact, philosophy is the purest of all subjects. It's all the way on the end, and in fact, philosophy is outside of the box that all the other subjects are in. Philosophy is the purest of all subjects, and that's what's important about its way of thinking. In fact, philosophy is critical, rational, and systematic. That's a philosophical way of thinking. And that's pretty much all there is to it. If you approach your subject in a critical way, and use rational and systematic arguments, then you're doing philosophy. And it's purist because this method of thinking requires the smallest amount of input possible from the real empirical world. Okay, so we've done politics, we've done philosophy. What's political philosophy? You might think that this is political philosophy. You've got philosophy on one side of your Venn diagram, you've got politics on the other, and you've got political philosophy in the middle. Well, that would be to say that politics is just that part of, political philosophy is just that part of politics that's philosophical, or that part of philosophy that deals with politics. So that's almost right, but it's not quite right. Remember what's important about politics and what's important about philosophy. What's important about politics is its subject matter. Politics deals with power. And what's important about philosophy is its way of thinking. Philosophy is critical, rational, and systematic. So, political philosophy is what happens when you apply the methods of philosophy to the subject matter of politics. Political philosophy is what happens when you do politics in a philosophical way. But there's more to be said about the philosophical way of doing politics. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the methods of political philosophy, how you do political philosophy, and how you examine the exercise of power. And this is the really important bit of the talk, because it tells you why you should care. Perhaps I should have put this slide first, actually, because that way you could have decided whether you cared about this or not right at the beginning, and you could have gone to listen about PDF vulnerabilities or something else if you didn't care. So why should you care? Well, here's a quote from the political philosopher Robert Nozick. And this is from his work, Anarchy, State and Utopia. And he's writing about the way that he thinks, the way he does political philosophy. And he says, "I write in the mode of much contemporary philosophical work in epistemology or metaphysics. There are elaborate arguments, claims rebutted by unlikely counterexamples, surprising theses, puzzles, abstract structural conditions, challenges to find another theory which fits a specified range of cases, startling conclusions, and so on. Though this makes for intellectual interest and excitement, I hope, some may feel that the truth about ethics and political philosophy is too serious and important to be obtained by such flashy tools. Nevertheless, it may be that correctness in ethics is not found in what we naturally think." So what's Nozick saying here? You'll notice that philosophers tend to go on a bit. He's saying that for the sort of problems that he's for interesting problems, the answers aren't always obvious. And so, in order to find the truth about interesting problems, you have to do it in a way that's not obvious. In order to find the truth about interesting problems, you have to use flashy tools, as he calls them, unusual methods. So the methods of political philosophy are unusual. It's a different way of thinking. It's not the way most people think in everyday life about mundane subjects. So does any of this sound familiar, perhaps? We're using unusual but effective methods that most people aren't familiar with in order to achieve a particular interesting goal. Well, I think that Robert Nozick is a hacker. I think that philosophers work something like penetration testers for ideas. They work around the edges, probe for weaknesses, try to find different ways of looking at the same things that other people don't use until they find a way through the ideas. So the methods of political philosophy are similar in spirit to the methods employed by hackers. Political philosophers are hackers, I suppose. So political philosophy as a subject is just hacking, but in the domain of political ideas. And the subject which political philosophy studies happens, remember, everywhere that there are people. So political philosophy is, I suppose, a form of hacking that can be done anywhere that there are people. So why does this apply to the internet in particular? Politics happens wherever people are, and there are people on the internet, so you might think, politics happens on the internet. Well, yes, that's obvious. But why is the internet of particular interest? Well, I'm not going to talk about things like virtual communities, like those that exist in Memorpagas, or like EVE Online, or World of Warcraft, or Farmville, or whatever. I'm not going to talk about those.